Oh, hello. Today is Monday, the 4th of December, and it's just me today. But I wanted to talk about mental health, and I wanted to talk about um, something that doesn't get talked about because I saw this article, um, and it came across my dashboard. And for like those of you who don't know, I have diagnosed lots of mental problems, like actually professionally diagnosed lots of things. One of them is autism spectrum disorder, and this article came across my Facebook, and it was about this mom who wants to basically be medical power of attorney for her son, so that she can basically uh, sterilize him. Um, Let me read the like the quote from um, her book, because she wrote a whole book about this, by the way. Um, I am deeply worried about the idea that he could get someone pregnant and yet could never be a real father, which is why I will insist on having medical power of attorney, so that I will be able to make the decision about a vasectomy for him after he turns 18. And I think that, we're people say that, like, we don't understand people with medical or mental health problems, and we don't talk about this, and we don't something that gets left behind a lot is that that's a really common thing, actually, is that people on the spectrum, we get kind of like told that we'll never be real parents, and then we can't function in society. There are Autism Speaks is a hate group, like, that is constantly advocating for eugenics and sterilization of autistic people. One of the things that they like to pretend that they don't do anymore, but they very much do, is they donate money to an organization that puts all of its money and all of its research into finding out how to screen in utero for autism spectrum disorder, so that it can be eradicated. Um, didn't think I needed to fucking say this, but autistic people are not a burden. I know that having a kid on the spectrum is difficult, and it's frustrating, and it's not easy, and I can understand and have sympathy for that. But you have to also realize that autistic people, we hear you, we hear the words that you say. We may not be able to understand a lot of emotional context or social interactions or things like that, but we're not stupid. We know what you're saying. We can, you know, I guess hear you is just the best way to put it. Um, and it's interesting that you know that's something that gets overlooked a lot when talking about mental health, is that, like, sterilization, because there are a lot of people that believe that even people with, like, bipolar disorder shouldn't have children, and that those people should also be sterilized, which is ridiculous to me. I mean, mental health does not affect your ability to parent. And in fact, to this woman, her name is Judith Newman, autistic people can have parents, and autistic people can be parents and have been parents for years. There is a beautiful book by a man named Elder Robinson about his life, and he talks about having a son, and he is a brilliant parent, and he does, even after having a really shitty parent like you, because honestly, lady, you're a fucking shitty parent. I'm just gonna say it. If you try to, autistic people don't need your constant babysitting. Sometimes they do, because it's a spectrum and there are levels of function, but they don't need you to make that kind of important decision for them. Um, and that's forced sterilization, which is something that's wrong, and you should be ashamed of yourself for thinking that. As someone on the spectrum, I'm disgusted by you as a person, that someone thought that you should be able to raise a child. That's disgusting to me. Anyway, but so he's got this book, and he talks about his son, who he calls Cubby, and it's a beautiful thing. And he had a shitty childhood and shitty parents and people who didn't care about him and his well-being and who he was as a person, and and he is a brilliant father. And I implore anyone to. It's called Look Me in the Eye. I implore anyone to look into it because he highlights something that's really important, is that autistic people can be parents, are parents, and make wonderful parents. Um, this whole podcast is just going to be about mental health. It's going to be 25 minutes of me talking about different kinds of mental health problems and disorders and the world around us and how we interact with people. Um, I just wanted to start with that because I was so pissed and so angry. It's really not your decision. Just because you are a power of attorney over someone, that does not mean, because parents can be power of attorney and parents can be, legal guardians of their children with mental health problems long after they're 18. But still, that child still has the ability to make medical decisions, and you should just not be able to fucking have kids if that's your opinion. Also, if you think that fucking that vaccines cause autism, fuck you, because they don't, first of all. Second of all, you're implying that being on the spectrum, you would rather your kid die of measles or mumps, or, someone else's kid die of measles or mumps who can't be vaccinated, because you would rather, put that person's life ahead of your kid being on the spectrum. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You just shouldn't be a parent. You really shouldn't. And the way that we deal with people on the spectrum is disgusting. As someone who has been through all different kinds of therapies, and there is a very big line in the sand between abusive, quote unquote, therapy and like actual therapy. Because as a child, the actual therapy that I got helped me more function rather than hide myself. But most people who meet me, they're like, well, I would have never known, because all of the bad therapy that I did get from people who didn't know how to properly deal with me and understand how people on the spectrum work was abusive. Like, there's just no way to put it. People who think that, I forgot what it's called, but there's a form of therapy where you basically like force a kid on the spectrum to do things that it's just awful. I forgot what it's called. There's a whole documentary on it and how it's spreading to England, and most psychologists will tell you that it's abusive. It's awful. When it was in the 60s, it was much worse, and so now, because it's not as bad as it was in the 60s, everyone thinks that everything's fine and we can still use this form of therapy, when in reality, you can know. If you talk to any person on the spectrum who's gone through this therapy, it's basically the same thing as like training your dog. You reward the behaviors you want to see and you punish the ones you don't. And punishment to an autistic person for doing something that, one, you're not telling them why it's not okay, first of all. Second of all, you're punishing an autistic kid for something they can't help. So like a prime example here is quiet hands. Like, so kids on the spectrum hand flap or they rock back and forth. And so what they used to do, I don't know if they still do this, but when I was in school they did. They would strap your hands into this chair if you wouldn't stop shaking your hands. And that is, you're restraining a kid for flapping their hands, not for hitting themselves, because that's a completely different conversation, but for hand flapping motions or rocking. That's another thing. They would strap you down if you were rocking, and I think that's disgusting and deplorable. And there are ways to alleviate some things that are quote unquote disruptive. My dog, sorry, she's sleeping, so she's gonna make noises. Like having trouble switching from things. Like, I get it, there are things that are just not conducive to life. Like, you have to go to grocery stores. But, who's to say what's normal, what's not? Like, I remember I had a therapist be like, well, you have to do these things because, in your life, you're going to do these things. Because I can't do certain grocery stores just because I can't process the sensory information. Because lots of kids on the spectrum, we have what's called sensory processing disorder. So like certain lights, certain colors, things like that, they're overwhelming, and then you have what you would consider quote unquote a tantrum or a meltdown, which really for me it just looks like crying. Lots of crying and covering my ears and scrunching up my face. But when I was a kid, it was like, well, you have to be. They would force you to go to those places, and it's painful. It's not uncomfortable. If you don't have sensory processing disorder, I can't explain it to you, but it's painful to be forced to eat foods that are textures that you can't handle or wear clothes that are textures you can't handle. When I was a kid, here's a prime example. When I was a kid, my mom, I was in dance, and there was the outfits we had to wear. They had sequins on them because dance. Um, and to this day, I'm this way about sequins. But my skin, I just couldn't handle it. It was painful. I would cry to the point that my mom had to put band-aids all up and down my sides, um, so that I would wear it because it was a fight. It was a struggle. I would cry. I would freak out. I couldn't do it because it's just my body couldn't handle that sensory information. And there are other things, like there are certain foods I cannot eat because in my mouth it hurts. It feels awful. Lights are the same way. I don't go to stores with fluorescent lights. Can't do Walmart. I can't do what's that called? It's not Safeway. You probably don't have a Safeway where you're from because I think that's just a West Coast thing. Safeway though I can do because they have cooler colors. While they have fluorescent lights, it's all their it's not blinding white. Walmart is white. Albertsons is white and blue. It's the same thing. Anything that's like that blinding, I can't do that. Things like that. So like, it's painful. It's not like a choice. Forcing a kid on the spectrum to do those things, while it may help you so you can feel like you are doing something productive, it hurts your kid. If a lot of therapy is super abusive because you're trying to force your kid to be normal, whatever the fuck that even means. A lot of therapy to like quote unquote help people on the spectrum is just to like make them neurotypical, which is the opposite of autistic, and you can't do that. I've literally had I just got a new therapist recently, and we were talking, and when I was like, yeah, I have ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, and they were like, are you sure? And I had to be like, yeah, because I'm very good because of that abusive therapy. Before I got a very wonderful woman who literally her job is to work with kids on the spectrum, I was used to the abusive therapies, and I was afraid of having to see those abusive therapists and having to interact with those people. So I just forced myself to, quote unquote, I guess, hide those behaviors. Like, I make a lot of eye contact now. But if I'm comfortable enough, I don't make a lot of eye contact with people. So, like, for example, because of this new therapist that I have, I don't feel like I need to do those neurotypical behaviors because it's a performance, it's a forced thing. And that's why I don't really hang out with people constantly during the week. So, like, I just recently had a friend over for 2 days, and it was the most exhausting thing in the world, even though we slept most of the time, because I feel like I'm constantly having to put up this performance. This friend in particular, we're close enough that I'm not putting up as much of a performance, but it's still, I feel like I have to do these certain things, to the point that by the end of it, I was just like, if this stretches out any longer, I'm just too exhausted, both physically and mentally, to like put up this performance forever. This podcast has become more about autism than mental health. I should just start a segment talking about different types of like mental disorders and how we like, because the world is super weird. For a country and a world that is like, it's not uncommon to meet someone or know someone with some kind of mental disorder, whether that's depression or anxiety or autism or whatever it is. We treat people with these kinds of health problems like absolute garbage, when like, if you had like a physical disability, they wouldn't treat you as much like garbage, which is super fucking annoying. But anyway, back to what I was saying. It's painful, and those tactics are abusive. And like I said before, to that fucking lady, and to anyone who, one, supports Autism Speaks, if you fucking wear blue in April, I don't trust you immediately, and we're not friends anymore, because, one, you didn't do any fucking research, or you didn't ever have talked to a person on the spectrum, an adult. Because any adult on the spectrum will tell you Autism Speaks is a hate group, and you really should not support them. You want to support a local autistic foundation. Like in my hometown, we have what's called the Isaac Foundation, where they actually help. Because all of the money that goes to Autism Speaks goes to those eugenics programs, and doesn't go. They claim that they help families when in reality they really don't. Most of that money goes to getting them to like referring them to places, not even seeing the like not even covering those things. Whereas here's a prime example of a good autistic foundation, an autism foundation that actually is an advocate and really good for the people it serves. So in my hometown, the Isaac Foundation is a place that offers what's called Sibling Spotlight on Saturdays for kids who have older siblings or younger siblings on the spectrum. So it's like a place to be like, this is difficult, because it is difficult to have someone in your family or in your life who's on the spectrum. But here's a moment to be like, here are some coping skills, and here are some things that you can do to help that sibling when you see that sibling having a meltdown, because that's stressful on kids. They have parent advocacy groups to be like, it sucks being a parent of a kid on the spectrum, but you have to learn to love your kid and take it them as they are. They cover lots and lots and lots of things. Like when I remember when I was a kid, they paid for and bought and installed a therapy swing, lots of therapy toys when I was younger, weighted blankets. And Autism Speaks doesn't do those things. They refer you to, they're like, oh, here's a therapist that's like, I think it's called CB something, that therapy. Here, we'll send you to this place, or we'll pump your kid full of drugs, or we'll do what. It's ridiculous. And people who still defend Autism Speaks make me so fucking mad. Like, and it's always neurotypical parents too. Like, I remember going to my family and being like, hey, maybe not support this organization because they're fucking awful. And my mom got so fucking pissed and shitty with me about it. And I was like, okay, maybe like listen to the person who would know what they're talking about, because I'm literally on the spectrum. That's the other thing. That's the other reason I don't tell people that either, because they like immediately treat you like you're 5 years old. Because Autism Speaks pushes this rhetoric that like no one wants an autistic child, because we're always a burden. We're always going to be like someone you have to take care of, and like to the point that like my parents believed that and thought for the longest time, and I sometimes still think that they do think this, that like I'm just going to live in their basement forever, and like I'm their adult child that lives with them. I'm not right now. I don't ever want to be, because no offense to my family, but we just cannot live together just because of conflicting beliefs on lots of things, and just the way that they handle things, and what's good for my mental health and what's good for their mental health, etc., etc. But my parents are the rare exception. I think this is the other reason that parents are so quick to be like, I would support eugenics for autistic people, is that the statistic for parents who start out married when they have an autistic child and then get divorced is very high. Like, the majority of parents do not stay together. And I totally understand that, because we're exhausting people. Oh my god, I know that we're, like, my mother and I have never really gotten along. We're not very close for lots of reasons, because she's done some things, and I've done some things, and we've said some not nice things to each other, me and my biological mom. But, like, oh man, especially when I was a kid, because meltdowns were a lot more common, and I hadn't gone to good therapy yet, so I was bottling up all of these things because I didn't want to go to the bad therapist. I just would scream, because we're loud. It's exhausting to take care of a kid on the spectrum, and I think that's the other thing, is that those kinds of mentalities, though, that we're exhausting and will always be exhausting, and that you have to force us to hide those behaviors because it's exhausting, leads to people like this mom who thinks that she should sterilize her son, and it leads to people who are on the spectrum thinking that we don't deserve neurotypical partners. Like, I'm always I brought this up the other day in my therapist's office. I'm always so afraid of like finding someone to fall in love with or marry, because I keep having this image in my head of like having a meltdown at a supermarket with my husband or wife or partner, and them just being like, I'm getting divorced from you because I can't handle this, or someone being my like not like boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner, and being like living with me, and then realizing that like how spectrumy I am, and being like, nah, son, we can't do this no more. It's a real fear because the world is so not understanding of people on the spectrum and not listening to us, and people who think that they know how to deal with people on the spectrum or think that they have some kind of experience then treat us awfully because they feel like they have permission. Like I've had volunteers at places at rec centers that I go to be try to act like my therapist and try to be like, no, like you can't do that, you can't do this socially, like I'm just trying to help you. Well, cool, I didn't ask for your help, so fucking shut up. So I typically don't tell people, especially friends, because they treat you like you're fragile, and they treat you like you're so breakable, and like they constantly have to, you know, do this or that to like make you comfortable. And I'm just like, how about no? How about we just keep treating me like, you know, a normal person, and if I'm confused about something, I'll fucking ask you. Like, I used to have this friend when I was in high school. She would constantly explain everything to me. And I'm like, you know, if I have a question about this social situation, I'll fucking ask. Otherwise, shut the fuck up. I didn't ask you, and you're treating me and talking to me like I am 5, and this is ridiculous. That's what I've noticed too, also, is that lots of, like, teachers or parents or whatever the fuck, they talk to you like you're a kid. And they explain everything. And I'm like, no, I asked a very specific question, and then I'll get an answer. Otherwise, shut up. The world is weird. Anyway, this is the first of, I guess, a series that I'm gonna start about mental health, and I'll have other people on board. The first episode was more of an introduction to who I am and how this platform goes, and how I just wanted to talk about random things and try to start this podcast up, but I guess this is more the official first. So thank you. My name is Keaton. I'm very queer, and this has been We're Queer. Have a nice day.